My name is Jake, and I work the night shift at a small, dusty storage facility on the outskirts of town. It's a lonely job, but it pays the bills. Every night, I sit in my dimly lit office, surrounded by the eerie silence of a building that's often forgotten. The only light comes from a flickering fluorescent bulb overhead and the faint glow of my computer screen. It's an unsettling place at night, with the distant creaks and groans of the old building as it settles. Last Tuesday, the air felt different. Maybe it was the damp chill or the way the shadows seemed thicker, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I brushed it off as fatigue. The job had been quiet for hours. Just me, my coffee, and the occasional hum of the industrial freezer in the back. Around 2 a.m., I decided to take a quick walk around the facility to stretch my legs. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out into the maze of storage units. As I walked, the narrow aisles between the towering metal boxes felt unusually claustrophobic, and the darkness seemed to cling to me like a second skin. I reached the end of the row when I noticed something strange. One of the storage units, which had always been locked, was slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just unlocked. It looked like someone had forced it open. I cautiously approached and shone my flashlight inside. The unit was empty except for a small, dusty box in the corner. I was about to turn away when I noticed something odd. A faint, red stain smeared on the inside of the unit. It looked like blood. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to stay calm. I was alone in the building, and my rational mind told me it could be anything, just a prank, maybe. I picked up the box, and as soon as I touched it, the temperature around me seemed to drop. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the box slowly, and inside was a collection of old photographs, faded and yellowed with age. They were mostly of people I didn't recognize, but one photo made me stop dead in my tracks. It was a picture of a young woman, her face partially obscured by shadows. She was standing in front of a house that looked eerily similar to the storage facility. I glanced around nervously, and that's when I noticed something even more disturbing. The woman in the photograph was wearing the same clothes as a woman I'd seen in the facility a few weeks ago, one of the customers who had come to store some items. I took a deep breath and decided it was time to call it a night. As I turned to head back to the office, I heard a faint sound, a soft, almost imperceptible scratching coming from the direction of the storage units. My flashlight flickered, and I felt my pulse quicken. I retraced my steps, shining my light into the darkness. The scratching grew louder, more urgent. I followed the sound to the unit next to the one I had just opened. My hand trembled as I reached for the lock. It was warm to the touch, even though it should have been cold. I hesitated for a moment before finally opening it. Inside, I found nothing but shadows. The unit was empty. I turned to leave, but then I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the aisle. It was a woman, her face obscured by shadows. I couldn't see her clearly, but her presence was unmistakable. She was just standing there, watching me. I froze, unable to move or speak. The temperature in the room dropped further, and I could see my breath misting in the air. The woman began to move towards me slowly, her footsteps making no sound on the concrete floor. I backed away, my flashlight shaking in my hand. As she got closer, her face came into view, and I gasped. It was the woman from the photograph, her eyes hollow and empty. She reached out towards me with a cold, skeletal hand. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. The flashlight slipped from my grasp and clattered to the ground, plunging me into darkness. I scrambled to my feet and bolted towards the exit, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of her footsteps grew louder behind me, relentless and eerie. I finally reached the office, slammed the door shut, and locked it. The scratching and footsteps ceased, but I knew she was still out there, waiting. I've never been back to that storage facility since that night. I quit my job and moved away, hoping to leave the terror behind. But every time I close my eyes, I still see her face, and I can't escape the feeling that she's still watching me, waiting for the right moment to come for me. I don't know what happened to that woman or why she was trapped in that storage unit, but I do know one thing. Some places hold onto their secrets, and sometimes those secrets are best left undisturbed. My name is Clara, and I work the night shift as a security guard at a massive, abandoned factory on the edge of town. It's a grim job, but it pays well. My shift starts at midnight and lasts until dawn, and it's always just me and the echoes of a once bustling industrial plant. The factory is an enormous labyrinth of cold concrete and rusting machinery. It's been closed for years, but the security company still maintains a presence here to ensure nothing of value is stolen or vandalized. My job is to patrol the grounds, check the security cameras, and ensure everything is as it should be. One night, about 2 weeks ago, I noticed something strange. The factory's security system had a glitch, causing the cameras to flicker and the lights to occasionally go out. I assumed it was a technical issue, but it made the already eerie atmosphere even more unsettling. I had just finished my routine patrol and was sitting in the security office, catching up on paperwork, when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere within the factory, like footsteps, but too deliberate and measured. I brushed it off as a mechanical issue or my imagination playing tricks on me. It wasn't unusual for old buildings to make odd noises. But then, the sound grew louder, and I could hear it clearly. Someone or something was walking around the factory. I checked the security monitors, but they were all static. I grabbed my flashlight and my radio and headed out to investigate. The factory's vast expanse felt even more intimidating in the dark. The sound led me to an old assembly line area, where the machinery was covered in a thick layer of dust. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. The sound had stopped. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the floor, a dark stain, as if someone had dragged something heavy across the concrete. My heart raced, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I radioed the control room, but there was no response. The communication system was down. I decided to investigate further. I followed the trail of the stain, which led me to an old storage room in the far corner of the factory. The door was slightly ajar, and the sound of the footsteps started again. This time, they were right behind me. I turned around, but the corridor was empty. I pushed the door open and shone my flashlight inside. The room was filled with old machinery and broken crates. In the center of the room was an old wooden crate, covered in dust. The stain on the floor seemed to lead directly to it. My curiosity got the better of me. I approached the crate and hesitated before opening it. Inside, I found a collection of old tools and parts, but nothing unusual, except for a small, leather-bound journal buried under some rusty gears. I picked up the journal, and as soon as I touched it, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but I could still make out some writing. It was written in a hurried scrawl, detailing strange occurrences and eerie sightings within the factory. The final entry was dated just before the factory's closure. Asterisk, something is wrong. I hear footsteps in the halls, but I'm the only one here. I feel like I'm being watched. I don't know how much longer I can stay. Asterisk. I was about to close the journal when I heard it again, the footsteps. This time they were louder and closer. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck and spun around to face the dark corridor. My flashlight flickered and went out. Panic set in. I fumbled for my spare flashlight and turned it on. The beam revealed a figure standing at the end of the hallway, pale, gaunt, and with hollow eyes. It was a man in worn, old-fashioned clothing, his face twisted in a silent scream. I backed away, stumbling over debris. The figure started moving towards me, its steps echoing through the factory. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the footsteps following me, growing louder and more frantic. I made it back to the security office, slamming the door shut and locking it. I could still hear the footsteps, now accompanied by a scratching sound as if something was trying to claw its way through the door. I called for help, but the radio was dead. I was trapped. Eventually, the sound stopped, and the factory fell silent. I waited until dawn, too terrified to move. When the day shift arrived, I told them everything, but they found no evidence of anything unusual. The factory was just as it had been, empty and silent. I quit the job the next day. The factory still stands, and occasionally, I hear stories from others about strange occurrences there. But I know what I experienced that night was real. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I still hear those footsteps and feel that cold breath on my neck. I don't know what happened to the man in the journal or why he was still wandering the factory, but I know one thing for certain. Some places are haunted by their past, and sometimes the ghosts never leave.
My name is Mark, and I work the night shift at a small, remote museum on the outskirts of town. It's an old building, filled with relics and artifacts from a bygone era. Most of the time, it's a quiet job. I'm alone, save for the occasional patrolling security guard. But there's something about this museum that has always unsettled me. Last Friday night, the air was thick with an oppressive silence. The museum was closed for renovations, and I was the only one there, tasked with monitoring the security cameras and ensuring the building remained undisturbed. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the walls of the exhibits. Around midnight, I started my routine check of the security feeds. Everything seemed normal until I noticed something peculiar. One of the cameras, located in the Egyptian exhibit, was showing an odd, grainy distortion. I dismissed it as a technical glitch and decided to investigate in person. As I walked through the museum's vast halls, I could feel a chill in the air, even though the heating was on. The Egyptian exhibit was located in the far corner of the museum, away from the main entrance. The hallway leading to it was lined with dusty old display cases and portraits of historical figures. When I reached the exhibit, the camera's feed was still glitching. I checked the equipment and adjusted the connections, but the distortion remained. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but it was hard to ignore. The room was dimly lit, and the artifacts on display seemed almost to watch me as I worked. I was just about to leave when I heard a faint, echoing sound, like whispers. I looked around, but the room was empty. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, coming from the center of the room. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I walked toward the source of the noise, and that's when I saw it. An old, ornate sarcophagus, slightly open. I was certain it had been sealed when I last checked. The whispers grew louder, now sounding almost like voices arguing. My heart raced, but curiosity drew me closer. I hesitated before peering inside. The sarcophagus was empty, but the whispers seemed to be coming from beneath it. As I shone my flashlight around, I noticed a small, hidden compartment beneath the sarcophagus. My fingers trembled as I pried it open. Inside, I found an ancient scroll, covered in strange, unfamiliar symbols. As I touched it, the temperature in the room dropped significantly. The whispers grew louder, turning into a cacophony of angry voices. I felt a cold hand brush against my arm, and I spun around, but there was no one there. The lights flickered, and the room seemed to warp and shift. Shadows danced along the walls, and the whispers turned into a roar. I stumbled backward, knocking over a display case. The artifacts within crashed to the floor, and I could see the sarcophagus lid beginning to close on its own. In a panic, I grabbed the scroll and fled the room. I ran through the museum, the whispers following me, growing louder and more frantic. I could feel the presence of something ancient and malevolent pursuing me. I raced back to the security office and locked the door behind me. My radio crackled to life, and a distorted voice came through, saying, "You shouldn't have taken it." I looked around, but there was no one there. The whispers continued, now a constant, oppressive presence in the room. The scroll seemed to pulsate with a dark energy, and I could feel its weight dragging me down. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the security office, unable to leave. The whispers and the feeling of being watched never subsided. When morning came, I handed the scroll over to the museum curator and told him everything. He seemed unfazed and assured me that it was probably just a trick of the mind. But I knew better. I quit that job the next day, and I haven't been back since. The museum still stands, and occasionally, I hear rumors about strange occurrences and unexplained phenomena. But I know the truth. Some artifacts should never be disturbed, and some places are haunted by things that are best left undisturbed. The whispers still haunt me sometimes, and I can't shake the feeling that the ancient voices are still following me, waiting for the next time I might cross their path. My name is Erica, and I work the night shift at an old, nearly forgotten library on the edge of town. It's a quaint place, filled with ancient books and dusty shelves. Most people avoid it, thinking it's past its prime, but I love the solitude and the quiet that comes with working in such a peaceful setting. One particularly stormy night, the power went out around 11 p.m. The only light was from the occasional flash of lightning outside, illuminating the library in brief, stark bursts. The storm was fierce, and the wind howled through the cracks in the old building. I sighed and lit a few candles, knowing I'd have to navigate the darkened library to check the generator in the basement. As I made my way to the basement door, I noticed something odd. A large, ornate key was lying on the floor near the entrance, where it definitely hadn't been before. It was old-fashioned, with intricate designs carved into the metal. I picked it up, intrigued. There was no note or indication of where it might belong. I continued to the basement, navigating the pitch-black stairs with only the candlelight to guide me. The generator was in the far corner, and it took me a few minutes to get it working again. The lights flickered back on, but the key still weighed heavily on my mind. Returning to the main floor, I found the key's presence even more unsettling. I decided to investigate further, so I began exploring the library's many locked doors. The library had always had a few rooms that were off-limits to staff, but I'd never seen inside them. Each room had a unique lock, and the key didn't fit any of them. Eventually, I came across an old, dusty door at the back of the library that I'd never noticed before. The lock was peculiar, resembling an intricate old-fashioned mechanism. I tried the key, and to my surprise, it fit perfectly. With a deep breath, I turned the key and pushed open the door. Inside was a small, dimly lit room, filled with even more dust and cobwebs. On the walls were shelves crammed with old, leather-bound books, their spines cracked and worn. But it was what lay in the center of the room that caught my attention. A single wooden table with a large, leather-bound book lying open on it. I approached the book, its pages yellowed and brittle. The book was open to a page covered in strange symbols and eerie drawings. I couldn't make sense of the writing, but it looked ancient and unsettling. As I leaned in to get a closer look, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, causing the candle flames to flicker wildly. The storm outside intensified, and the wind howled louder. I could hear the sound of heavy breathing coming from somewhere behind me. I turned around, but the room was empty. The breathing continued, growing louder and more labored. I quickly closed the book and backed away, but the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. I was trapped. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and I could see my breath fogging up in the cold air. The breathing turned into a deep, guttural growl. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The growling grew louder, almost as if something, or someone, was moving closer. Panic set in. I searched the room for anything that might help me escape, but all I found were the old, dusty books and the eerie silence. In a desperate move, I grabbed the book from the table and threw it at the door, hoping to break it down. The book struck the door, and for a moment, everything went silent. The growling ceased, and the temperature began to rise back to normal. The door creaked open slowly, and I stumbled out into the main library. The key was still in my hand, but the library was eerily quiet now. The storm had passed, and the power had fully returned. I looked back at the door, but it was as if the room had never existed. The key no longer seemed to fit any lock, and there were no signs of the room or the book. I left the library that night, never speaking of what happened. I don't know what was in that hidden room or why the key led me there. All I know is that the storm seemed to awaken something that was better left undisturbed. I still work the night shift at the library, but I never venture near that door again. Sometimes, when the storm rolls in and the wind howls outside, I can't help but feel that whatever was in that room is still watching me, waiting for its next chance to be discovered. My name is Tom, and I work the night shift at a historical asylum that has been converted into a museum. The asylum was once a place of suffering and confinement, and even though it's been closed for decades, the building still holds a dark and unsettling aura. My job is to patrol the hallways, ensure the alarms are functioning, and handle any issues that arise. Last night was particularly unsettling. A fierce storm was raging outside, and the howling wind made the old asylum creak and groan. I was alone in the building, save for the occasional flickering lights and the eerie silence that seemed to fill every corner. Around midnight, while doing my usual rounds, I noticed something strange. One of the old patient rooms, which had been sealed off and locked for years, was slightly ajar. My flashlight revealed that the door was creaking open, even though it had been locked before. I approached the door cautiously, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The room inside was as I remembered, dusty and filled with old, broken furniture. But something felt off. The air was colder here, and the room seemed to be holding its breath. As I stepped inside, I noticed a faint, distant sound, like whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but they seemed to be coming from behind the walls. The whispers grew louder as I approached an old, battered closet in the corner of the room. I opened the closet door, revealing old, moth-eaten clothing and a few discarded personal items. Behind these, I found a small, dusty wooden box. My heart raced as I carefully opened it, revealing an old diary. The cover was cracked, and the pages were yellowed with age. I began to read the diary, which belonged to a patient named Lydia. Her entries were disturbing, detailing strange occurrences and eerie happenings in the asylum. She wrote about hearing voices, feeling watched, and seeing shadowy figures in the hallways. Her last entry was a desperate plea for help. Asterisk, the voices are getting louder. I can see them now, watching me from the corners of my cell. They say they are trapped and that I am the only one who can help them. I don't know how much longer I can stay. Asterisk. As I read, I felt a cold breeze on my neck and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I turned around quickly, but the room was empty. The whispers were now a cacophony of desperate voices, echoing through the asylum's hallways. I decided to investigate further, following the sound of the whispers. They led me down a long, dark corridor that I had never noticed before. The hallway was filled with old, rusted medical equipment and broken furniture, adding to the sense of foreboding. The whispers grew louder and more frantic as I reached the end of the corridor. I found an old, heavy door that was slightly ajar. Beyond it was a small, hidden room, filled with old medical records and forgotten equipment. The air in the room was thick and oppressive. In the center of the room was a large, old-fashioned chair with leather straps. The chair was covered in dust, but it was clear that it had been used for some dark purpose. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that the whispers were coming from the chair itself. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and the room was plunged into darkness. The whispers turned into agonized screams, and I felt a cold, unseen presence closing in. I stumbled around, trying to find the door, but the room seemed to shift and change, disorienting me. The screams grew louder, more desperate, and I could feel the weight of the asylum's dark history pressing down on me. I was trapped, unable to escape the echoes of the past. I finally found the door and forced it open, stumbling back into the main corridor. I raced back to the security office, my heart pounding. The whispers and screams had stopped, but the feeling of being watched remained. I locked the door and sat there, trembling, until dawn. When morning came, I reported the incident, but no one else seemed to notice anything unusual. The hidden room was gone, and the old door had been sealed once again. I was left with the haunting memories of that night and the echoes of Lydia's desperate cries. I still work the night shift at the asylum, but I avoid the old corridors and hidden rooms. The echoes of the asylum's dark past are still with me, a constant reminder that some places are forever haunted by the suffering they once held.
My name is Laura, and I work the night shift as a janitor at an old, abandoned hotel that was once a luxurious destination. The building is now a crumbling relic of its former self, with peeling wallpaper, broken chandeliers, and empty, echoing halls. My job is to clean the place and make sure nothing is out of place. But most nights, I find myself more concerned with the eerie silence and strange occurrences. Last night was particularly unsettling. A storm had rolled in, and the wind howled through the cracked windows, sending shivers down my spine. The hotel's vast lobby was dimly lit by a few flickering emergency lights, casting long shadows on the walls. Around midnight, I was working on cleaning the grand ballroom, a massive room with a once majestic crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling. The ballroom had been empty for years, and the only sounds were the echoes of my footsteps and the distant rumbling of the storm outside. As I worked, I noticed something odd. The large, ornate mirror on the wall, once a centerpiece of the room, was reflecting a strange, distorted image. The reflection seemed off, almost as if it was showing a different scene from what was actually in the room. I chalked it up to a trick of the light and continued cleaning. But then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the reflection of the mirror, I saw a figure standing behind me, someone dressed in old-fashioned clothing, looking directly at me. I spun around, but the room was empty. My heart pounded as I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, standing perfectly still. I approached the mirror cautiously, but the reflection remained the same. The figure, a man in a tuxedo from the early 1900s, stared back with a vacant expression. I could see his eyes following me as I moved. I reached out to touch the mirror, but my hand met only cold glass. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath fogging up in the air. The figure in the mirror began to move, slowly advancing towards the edge of the reflection. I backed away, but the mirror's image grew more vivid. The man in the mirror raised his hand, as if reaching out to me. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash behind me. I spun around to see a small table had fallen over, its contents scattered across the floor. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. The reflection now showed only the empty room. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. I continued cleaning, but the feeling of being watched never left me. The storm outside intensified, and the howling wind seemed to echo through the empty halls. As I moved to clean the nearby lobby, I noticed the mirror's reflection again. This time it was different. The reflection showed a scene of the hotel in its prime. A bustling ballroom filled with elegantly dressed people dancing and socializing. The sound of laughter and music seemed to emanate from the mirror, mingling with the storm's roar. I felt a strange pull, as if the reflection was drawing me in. The music grew louder, and the laughter more insistent. I approached the mirror, mesmerized by the scene. But as I reached out, the reflection suddenly changed. The ballroom was empty, and the man in the tuxedo stood in the center, his face twisted in a silent scream. The mirror's surface rippled, and I felt a cold hand grasp my arm. I pulled away, but the grip was strong, as if something was trying to drag me into the reflection. I stumbled back, desperately trying to break free. The mirror's surface seemed to pulse and shift, as if alive. With a final burst of strength, I yanked myself away from the mirror and ran from the ballroom. I locked the door behind me and sat in the lobby, trying to catch my breath. The storm outside finally began to subside, but the feeling of dread lingered. When my shift ended, I left the hotel and never returned. The mirror and the reflections still haunt my dreams. Sometimes, when I pass by old mirrors, I catch glimpses of distorted reflections and feel the icy touch of unseen hands. The hotel stands empty, its grand mirror still waiting, reflecting not just the past but something far darker. My name is Dave, and I work the night shift as a maintenance worker at an old, once grand theater in the heart of the city. The theater had seen better days. Now it was a shell of its former self, with peeling paint, creaking floors, and a musty smell that seemed to permeate everything. My job was to ensure that everything was in working order, but the old building had a way of making the nights feel much longer than they should. Last night, the theater was eerily quiet, save for the occasional groan of the building settling and the distant sound of rain tapping against the windows. I was in the middle of my rounds, checking the backstage areas and ensuring everything was secure, when I noticed something odd. In the backstage area, there was a room that had always been locked and unused. It was marked on the blueprints as prop storage, but it had long been forgotten. I'd never been inside, and the door had always been sealed shut. But tonight, the door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness peeking through. Curiosity got the better of me, so I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was filled with old, dusty props and costumes from the theater's past productions. The air was thick with dust, and the dim light from my flashlight revealed cobwebs draped across old costumes and forgotten scenery. In the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, covered in a tattered sheet. I approached it, feeling a sense of unease as I pulled the sheet away. The mirror was enormous, its frame intricately carved with patterns I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. The glass was old and slightly warped, giving the reflection an odd, distorted quality. As I examined the mirror, I noticed that the room seemed unusually silent. The rain outside had stopped, and the theater was devoid of the usual creaks and groans. It was as if the entire building had gone still. I leaned closer to the mirror, noticing something strange. The reflection showed not just the room I was standing in, but also a vague, shadowy figure standing behind me. I turned around quickly, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there, standing perfectly still. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The figure in the mirror seemed to be dressed in old-fashioned theater attire, similar to what was in the prop storage. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel its gaze piercing through the darkness. I backed away from the mirror, my heart pounding. The figure in the reflection began to move, slowly approaching the edge of the glass. I turned to leave the room, but the door slammed shut behind me. The mirror's surface began to ripple, and the shadowy figure seemed to press against the glass, reaching out towards me. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath fogging up in the cold air. The figure in the mirror grew more defined, its face becoming clearer but still shrouded in darkness. It raised a hand, as if begging for something. Panicking, I grabbed a nearby prop and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered, and the room was plunged into darkness. I could hear the figure's cries and the sound of glass crunching underfoot. I stumbled through the room, finally managing to force the door open and escape. I ran through the theater, my heart racing and my mind reeling from what I had seen. The building seemed to be back to its normal, creaky self, but the feeling of being watched never left me. When I reached the front doors, I burst outside into the cool night air. The mirror was never mentioned again, and the room was locked up tightly. I told my supervisors about the incident, but they dismissed it as a trick of the light or my imagination. I haven't worked a night shift at the theater since then. Sometimes, I still dream about that room and the shadowy figure in the mirror. The theater stands silent and still, but I know that some reflections hold more than just an image. They hold memories or something far darker. My name is Alex, and I work the night shift as a security guard at an abandoned psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town. The hospital, built in the early 1900s, was once a state-of-the-art facility, but it had been closed for decades. Now it stands as a relic of a time long past, its halls echoing with the whispers of forgotten patients and long-gone staff. My job involves patrolling the building, checking the security systems, and making sure nothing out of the ordinary happens. Most nights, it's a quiet and uneventful shift, but there's something about the hospital's eerie atmosphere that makes every creak and groan of the old building seem amplified. Last night, the weather was stormy, with lightning flashing across the sky and heavy rain pouring down. The storm seemed to add to the oppressive atmosphere of the hospital, and the howling wind seemed to carry with it an unsettling sense of anticipation. Around midnight, I started my routine check of the building. The first few hours passed without incident, and I methodically moved from one wing of the hospital to another, checking doors, windows, and the various security cameras. Everything seemed normal until I reached the eastern wing of the hospital, an area that had been sealed off for years and was rarely accessed. The eastern wing was home to the hospital's old wards, where the most troubled patients were once housed. It was said to be one of the most haunted parts of the building, and I'd always avoided it if I could. However, tonight, something felt different. The door to the wing, which had always been locked tight, was slightly ajar. A sliver of darkness peeked through, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I hesitated but decided to investigate. I pushed the door open and stepped into the dimly lit hallway. The air was colder here, and the silence was profound, almost as if the building itself was holding its breath. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the floors were covered in dust and debris. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the thunder rumbling like distant footsteps. As I walked down the corridor, I noticed that the lights flickered intermittently. The old patient rooms were visible through broken windows in the doors, their interiors shrouded in darkness. I could barely make out the remnants of old beds and furniture, now covered in a thick layer of dust. The further I went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. I could hear faint sounds, like whispers or distant conversations, carried on the wind. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and I could sense something lurking just out of sight. I reached the end of the corridor and came to a large, ornate door marked Ward 13. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see a faint light coming from within. My flashlight flickered, and I could make out the faint outline of old, rusted medical equipment and abandoned files scattered across the floor. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was large and dimly lit by a single, flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with old filing cabinets and shelves filled with yellowed papers and old medical records. In the center of the room was a large, wooden desk, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. On the desk was an old leather-bound book. It was open, and the pages were filled with strange, handwritten notes and sketches. I felt a strange pull towards the book, as if it was beckoning me to read its contents. I picked it up and began to read. The book belonged to Dr. Malcolm, one of the hospital's former head physicians. His notes detailed various experiments and treatments he had conducted on the patients. The further I read, the more disturbing the entries became. Dr. Malcolm wrote about using unconventional and often cruel methods to treat his patients, and the notes became increasingly erratic and fragmented. One entry caught my eye. Asterisk, the patient's cries grow louder each night. I can hear them, even when the wards are empty. They are angry, and they want something. I must find a way to silence them before they drive me mad. Asterisk. As I read, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room. The light bulb flickered more violently, and the temperature dropped. The whispers from earlier grew louder, turning into anguished cries and desperate pleas. I looked around, but the room seemed to be empty. Suddenly, the door to Ward 13 slammed shut with a deafening bang. I tried to open it, but it was locked tight. The room was filled with the sound of disembodied voices, and the temperature continued to drop. I could see my breath fogging up in the cold air. The whispers turned into screams, and I felt a presence closing in around me. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, moving and shifting as if they were reaching out for me. I grabbed the book and ran towards the door, desperately trying to find a way out. In my panic, I knocked over a stack of filing cabinets, sending papers flying across the room. The screams grew louder, more frantic. I felt hands, cold, invisible hands, grasping at my arms and shoulders, trying to pull me back. With a final, desperate effort, I slammed my shoulder into the door, breaking it open. I stumbled into the corridor, the screams fading behind me. I ran through the hospital, my heart pounding, until I reached the front entrance. I burst outside into the storm, gasping for air. I never returned to the eastern wing of the hospital after that night. The book and the old records were left behind, and the door to Ward 13 was sealed once again. The abandoned hospital still stands, and the whispers and cries of its past seem to linger in the air. Sometimes, when I pass by the old building, I can't help but feel that the echoes of the patients and Dr. Malcolm's dark experiments are still waiting, hidden within the shadows. My name is Sarah, and I work the night shift as a broadcast technician at an old, defunct radio station on the outskirts of town. The station, once a hub of activity, had been abandoned for years, but the building was still equipped with old radio equipment and a broadcast studio that hadn't been touched since it went off the air. My job involves monitoring the equipment, ensuring everything is in good working order, and occasionally running maintenance checks. It's usually a quiet shift, filled with the hum of machines and the occasional crackle of static from the old equipment. However, last night was anything but ordinary. The storm outside was fierce, with lightning illuminating the sky in violent bursts and rain beating against the windows with relentless fury. Inside the station, the atmosphere was heavy, and the power flickered intermittently, adding to the unsettling feeling that something was about to go wrong. Around midnight, I was in the main broadcast studio, running a routine check on the old transmission equipment. The studio was filled with dusty old microphones, reels of tape, and large, outdated consoles. The air was thick with the smell of old equipment and mildew. As I worked, I noticed that one of the old radio consoles, which had been turned off for years, had a faint, flickering light coming from it. Curious, I approached the console and found that it was emitting a low, static-filled hum. The lights on the console blinked erratically, and the dials seemed to move on their own, as if someone or something was tampering with them. I tried to turn off the console, but it wouldn't respond. The static grew louder, and then, through the crackling noise, I heard a faint voice. At first, it was barely audible, but as I adjusted the dials, the voice grew clearer. It was a woman's voice, speaking in a hurried, distressed tone. "Help me! They're coming!" I felt a shiver run down my spine. The voice seemed to be coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. I looked around the empty studio, but it was silent and still. The voice continued, pleading for help, growing more desperate with each passing moment. I decided to trace the source of the broadcast, following the cables and wires connected to the console. The transmission led me to a smaller, more secluded room at the back of the studio. The room was filled with old reel-to-reel tape recorders and other antiquated broadcasting equipment. In the corner of the room was an old, dusty radio receiver. The voice was coming from this receiver, but it wasn't supposed to be operational. I turned the dials and tried to tune the receiver, but it seemed to be stuck on a single frequency, broadcasting the same distressed message over and over. The storm outside intensified, and the wind howled through the broken windows. The voice on the receiver grew louder, more frantic, and I could hear the sounds of footsteps and banging in the background, as if someone was trying to break through. Suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness as the power flickered and went out. I was left in pitch-black silence, with only the faint glow of the emergency lights providing a dim illumination. The voice on the receiver stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie, unsettling silence. I fumbled for my flashlight and turned it on, scanning the room for any sign of what might have caused the power outage. As I did, I noticed something strange. A set of footprints leading from the receiver to the back of the room. The footprints were wet, as if someone had walked through a puddle of water, but the storm outside had not caused any water to seep into the building. I followed the footprints, which led to a hidden door at the back of the room. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a small, dark space behind it. I hesitated but pushed the door open and stepped inside. The hidden space was small and cramped, filled with old, forgotten equipment and dusty files. In the center of the room was an old recording booth, its walls lined with old tape reels and microphones. The air was heavy with the smell of old machinery and dampness. I approached the recording booth and noticed a single reel-to-reel tape recorder still running. The tape was almost finished, and the voice on the tape was the same as the one I had heard earlier, pleading for help and describing the sounds of someone breaking in. As I listened, I heard a loud crash behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The tape recorder's tape began to wind back, and the voice on the tape grew more distorted and frantic. I felt a cold draft and saw my breath fogging up in the air. Panicked, I grabbed the tape recorder and fled the hidden room. I raced back to the main studio, where the power had finally returned. The console and receiver were silent now, and the studio was as it had been before, quiet and empty. I left the station as quickly as I could, not looking back. The voice and the footprints haunted me long after I left the building. I never went back to the radio station, and the place remains abandoned, a silent testament to something or someone that still lingers in the darkness. Sometimes, when the storm rages outside and the wind howls through the night, I hear that voice again, echoing in my mind. The radio station stands silent, but the echoes of the past continue to broadcast their desperate pleas, waiting for someone to listen. My name is Matt, and I work the night shift as a security guard at a large, old office building that has been largely vacated. The building, a once bustling hub of activity, now sits almost entirely empty, its corridors echoing with the sounds of long-gone employees. My job is to patrol the floors, check security cameras, and ensure that nothing out of the ordinary happens. Last night, the atmosphere in the building was particularly unsettling. A cold front had moved in, and the wind howled outside, causing the windows to rattle and the old structure to creak. Inside, the building was eerily quiet, with only the hum of the occasional malfunctioning fluorescent light and the distant sound of the HVAC system. Around midnight, I began my usual rounds. The building's layout was a labyrinth of darkened hallways, abandoned offices, and empty conference rooms. The dim emergency lights cast long, flickering shadows on the walls, creating an oppressive atmosphere. As I walked through the fourth floor, I heard something strange, footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, but the footsteps were rhythmic and deliberate, as if someone was walking just ahead of me. I quickened my pace, thinking I might have missed a door left ajar or someone still in the building. The footsteps grew louder as I approached the end of the hallway. I turned the corner, but there was no one there. The corridor was empty, and the only sound was the distant hum of the air conditioning. I stopped to listen, but the footsteps had ceased. I continued my patrol, but the feeling of being watched persisted. The footsteps returned intermittently, always just out of sight. Each time I turned a corner or entered a new room, I found nothing but empty, silent spaces. Around 2 a.m., I decided to investigate the building's basement, a place I rarely visited. The basement was a maze of storage rooms and old maintenance areas, dimly lit by flickering bulbs. I descended the stairs, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. In the basement, the footsteps grew louder again, now accompanied by the sound of muffled voices. The voices seemed to be coming from behind a door at the far end of the basement, one that I had never seen before. The door was old and rusty, with a sign that read "Archives" barely legible through the grime. I approached the door cautiously. The voices grew clearer, and I could make out fragments of conversation, but the words were indistinguishable. I reached for the door handle, but it was locked. I could hear the footsteps moving around inside, as if someone was pacing back and forth. Frustrated, I tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps and voices stopped abruptly, replaced by an unsettling silence. I leaned closer to the door, trying to hear any further sounds, but the silence was deafening. I decided to return to the main floors, feeling uneasy. As I ascended the stairs, I noticed something odd. The temperature in the building seemed to drop suddenly, and I could see my breath forming faint clouds in the air. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows, and the wind outside grew stronger, adding to the sense of foreboding. When I reached the fourth floor again, the footsteps started up once more, this time accompanied by a soft, haunting melody. The sound was coming from an old office at the end of the hall. I approached the office and found the door slightly ajar. Inside, the office was filled with dusty old furniture and a desk cluttered with papers. On the desk was an old record player, its needle gently scratching across a vinyl record. The melody was hauntingly beautiful but also deeply unsettling. I reached for the record player to stop the music, but as I touched it, the music abruptly stopped, and the room was filled with a heavy silence. I turned around to leave, but the door to the office slammed shut behind me. The room's temperature dropped drastically, and I could see my breath fogging up in the cold air. The lights flickered, and the shadows on the walls seemed to move on their own. The footsteps began again, louder and more frantic. They seemed to be coming closer, echoing through the empty office. I could hear the faint sound of a woman's voice, crying out in distress. I tried to open the door, but it remained locked. In a panic, I searched the room for a way out. I noticed a small window at the back of the office, partially hidden behind a stack of old files. I forced it open and climbed through, landing on the fire escape outside. I didn't look back as I descended the stairs and exited the building. I never returned to the office building after that night. The echoes of footsteps and the haunting melody lingered in my mind. The building still stands, a silent sentinel to the restless spirits that seem to wander its empty halls. Sometimes, when the wind howls and the temperature drops, I hear the faint sound of footsteps and a haunting melody, a reminder of that unsettling night. My name is Jenny, and I work the night shift as a custodian in an old clock tower that's been out of commission for decades. The clock tower, with its intricate gears and massive clock face, is a historical landmark that's been maintained for preservation purposes but hasn't seen active use since the 1950s. My job is to clean the tower and ensure everything remains in good condition, even though no one really visits it anymore. Last night, a thick fog had rolled in, shrouding the tower in an eerie mist. The fog seemed to amplify the creaks and groans of the old building, making each sound seem more ominous. Inside the tower, the atmosphere was heavy, filled with the smell of old wood and rusted metal. I started my shift in the lower levels, dusting and cleaning the old machinery. The ticking of the dormant clock mechanism was constant, a rhythmic reminder of the tower's former purpose. As I worked, I noticed that the ticking seemed to grow louder, almost as if the clock was coming back to life. Around midnight, I decided to climb up to the top of the tower to check the main clock face. The climb was long and steep, with narrow, winding stairs that seemed to spiral endlessly. The fog outside had turned the night into a dense, impenetrable darkness, and the only light was from my flashlight and the occasional beam of moonlight filtering through the dusty windows. When I reached the top, the main clock room was dimly lit by the faint glow of my flashlight. The massive clock face was covered in grime, and the intricate gears and mechanisms were frozen in place. I began cleaning the glass of the clock face, but something felt off. The ticking was now a constant, insistent noise, even though the clock's hands remained motionless. As I worked, I heard a faint sound, like a metallic clang, coming from behind me. I turned around, but the room was empty. The fog outside pressed against the windows, and the sound of the wind howling through the tower's structure made the atmosphere even more foreboding. I continued cleaning, but the noise persisted. It sounded like someone or something was moving around among the gears and mechanisms. The ticking grew louder and more irregular, as if the clock was struggling to start up again. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath forming visible clouds in the air. Suddenly, the room was filled with a loud, grinding noise, and the clock's hands jerked slightly. The entire mechanism seemed to shudder and groan, as if it was trying to come back to life. The fog outside thickened, and the light from my flashlight flickered. I approached the clock's mechanism to investigate, but as I got closer, the noise stopped abruptly. The room fell silent, and the temperature dropped even further. I felt a presence behind me, as if someone or something was watching me. The ticking resumed, but it was now a rapid, erratic rhythm. I turned around and saw something that made my blood run cold. The gears and cogs of the clock were moving on their own, despite the clock being supposed to be inactive. The clock face's hands were slowly moving forward, as if the clock was trying to reset itself. The fog outside seemed to press closer, and the wind howled with a haunting wail. I could hear the faint, ghostly echoes of voices, as if a distant crowd was calling out from beyond the fog. The entire room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls seeming to shift and warp with the irregular ticking of the clock. In a panic, I tried to shut off the power to the clock mechanism, but the controls were unresponsive. The gears continued to turn, and the clock's hands moved faster and faster. The ghostly voices grew louder, and I could see shadowy figures moving among the gears, their faces obscured but their presence unmistakable. Desperate to escape, I fled from the clock room, racing down the spiral staircase. The ticking of the clock followed me, echoing through the narrow stairs. I burst out of the tower and into the dense fog, the cold night air hitting me with a jolt. I never returned to the clock tower after that night. The tower remains silent and still, its clock mechanism untouched and dormant once more. But the echoes of that night linger in my mind. The relentless ticking, the ghostly voices, and the feeling of being watched. The fog still rolls in from time to time, and when it does, I can't help but remember the haunted rhythms of the clockwork that tried to come back to life.